They called it a conference, but it was a war. In a quiet room in Berlin, 13 nations sat down to divide a continent they'd never seen. And when they left, Africa no longer belonged to Africans. Yes, you heard it right. The greatest war for Africa wasn't fought with bullets, no smoke, no gunfire, no marching boots. And yet, by the winter of 1884, an entire continent had been conquered. It happened in Berlin, not on a battlefield, but in a room of chandeliers and polished oak tables. There, the fate of millions was decided by a handful of men who'd never set foot on the soil they claimed to own. They called it the Berlin Conference. But it was, in truth, the most efficient invasion in human history, one carried out through ink, deception, and arrogance, disguised as diplomacy. At the head of the table sat Otto von Bismarck, Germany's Iron Chancellor, a man of order, calculation. He had no real interest in Africa, not at first. But he saw the hunger of Britain, France, and Belgium growing, and in that hunger he saw opportunity. So he gathered them all, the kings, the ministers, the merchants, and offered a stage where they could divide Africa peacefully. Peacefully. That was the lie. They weren't preventing war. They were making sure no one else got more than their share of the spoils. One by one, the powers of Europe leaned over the map. Lines were drawn across deserts, forests, and rivers they couldn't even name. Borders were carved through tribes, families, and languages. Each stroke of the pen was an act of conquest. And when the meeting ended, Africa, once whole, had been reduced to pieces. No treaty in history would ever carry as much hidden violence as that one. They said it was progress. They called it civilization. But the truth was simpler. It was greed wearing the mask of order. The people of Africa never signed those papers. They were never asked. Yet, from that day forward, the map of their world belonged to strangers. The Berlin Conference was sold as peace. But it was, in every sense, a war that never was. They called it diplomacy. But what truly sat in that room was greed, dressed in fine suits and gold-tipped pens. At the head of the table, Otto von Bismarck presided like a conductor. The Iron Chancellor, the man who had unified Germany through blood and steel, now sought to unify Europe through paper and deceit. He claimed he wanted peace, to prevent war among the great powers. But his peace was merely control, a way to keep the wolves fed so they wouldn't turn on each other. To his right sat King Leopold II of Belgium, a monarch whose empire was smaller than his ambitions. He spoke softly, eloquently, hiding a monstrous hunger behind polite smiles. He didn't come to claim a colony. He came to claim a kingdom, the Congo, a land so vast it could swallow all of Europe whole. He promised to bring civilization and faith to its people. But in truth, he sought ivory, rubber, and souls to enslave. Across the table, Britain and France traded looks like rival predators, circling the same prey. For centuries, they had fought each other for dominance. Now they sat shoulder to shoulder, carving new lines that would stretch their flags across deserts and jungles they'd never set foot in. Each believed they were expanding civilization. Each believed they were chosen by destiny, and neither cared who would bleed for it. Then there were the others, Portugal, Spain, Italy, latecomers to the feast. Each demanded their share, waving old maps and royal charters as if history itself gave them permission to steal. Some claimed ancient rights. Others simply pointed and said, "This will be ours." No one spoke for Africa. No one asked what the kingdoms of Ashanti, Benin, or Buganda thought of their fate. To the men in that room, those names meant nothing. just obstacles on a map. As cigars burned low and the room filled with smoke, the conference turned into a marketplace of empires. Rivers became borders, mountains became property. The lines they drew ignored every culture, every tribe, every ancient boundary. It was not negotiation, it was erasure. When Bismarck finally stood, his voice was calm, his tone diplomatic. He declared that the scramble for Africa would now proceed in peace, that Europe had reached a civilized understanding. But beneath the applause, something darker had begun. The conference had ended a rivalry between empires by creating one between nations and the land itself. From that room in Berlin, the blueprint of future suffering had been drawn, a quiet war that would soon ignite across Africa, not with armies, but with greed, guns, and ghosts. While Europe celebrated its peace, Africa didn't even know a war had begun. Across the continent, life continued, the rhythm of drums, markets, prayers, and harvests, unaware that somewhere far away, strangers had drawn invisible lines that would soon cut through their world. In the Congo basin, chiefs gathered under the shade of ancient trees, speaking of trade, alliances, and spirits, unaware that their lands now bore a new name on European maps: the Congo Free State. Free, in name only. In the kingdom of Ashanti, golden thrones still gleamed under the tropical sun. The people believed their power would last forever. They had beaten the British before. But a messenger was already on the road from the coast, carrying news that the British had returned, this time claiming protectorate status. A polite word for ownership. And in the Horn of Africa, the Ethiopians prayed, watched, and waited. They had seen empires rise and fall. But even they didn't know that soon they would be surrounded on all sides by European flags. A war was coming to them too. A war of maps, not swords. Pause for a second. What happens to a continent when its people wake up to find their land is no longer theirs? When the conqueror's flag rises, not after a battle, but after a meeting they were never invited to. This was the quiet moment before the storm, the breath before the scream. Caravans still crossed the Sahara, traders still bartered gold for salt, but the balance was already broken. European explorers, men with guns, gifts, and lies, began arriving with paper treaties written in languages no one in Africa could read. A single signature, a single thumbprint, could now erase an entire kingdom. The British offered protection, the French promised roads, the Belgians offered faith. But every promise hid the same truth. The deal had already been made. In some villages, elders burned the papers in disbelief. In others, they tried to fight. But how do you fight a war that doesn't yet exist? How do you defend yourself against a decision already written into history? As months passed, the first flags were planted. Small, silent symbols of something much larger. A river post here, a fort there, each one a spark in a dry forest. And still, Africa remained unaware of the scale of the theft. Because the real invasion had no armies. It had maps. And those maps were spreading like disease. The drums of the old kingdoms still beat proudly, but no one knew it was already too late. Because when the ink dried in Berlin, somewhere, in a dim office in Brussels, a young mapmaker drew lines he didn't understand. Straight, clean, efficient. Thousands of miles away, an African boy traced the same river with his finger and wondered why his world suddenly had new names. So did the freedom of millions. They wore crowns and epaulets. They spoke of progress, of science, of a duty to uplift. They called it the civilizing mission, a phrase that dressed theft in language and murder in manners. For the public back home, the story was simple. Newspapers printed speeches about roads, schools, and hospitals. Portraits showed smiling missionaries handing books to children beneath banners that read liberty and commerce. It looked noble, it sounded necessary, and most importantly, it distracted. Behind those speeches, the work was different. A company claiming to be philanthropic would arrive with rifles in its crates and chains in its ledgers. A missionary's Bible became an invoice. A promise of education became a demand for labor. Every institution of help served as cover for extraction. Take King Leopold II's Congo, a private fiefdom ruled by a monarch who answered to no parliament but to his own profit. Leopold sold a story to Europe. He would end the slave trade, bring civilization, plant the cross. Europe nodded and applauded. The maps were redrawn, and the Congo appeared on the page as a single entity, clean, orderly, and ready for reform. But maps lie when men lie. What Leopold called a benevolent stewardship became a machine of forced labor and terror. Villages that once paid tribute to kings now paid quotas in rubber and ivory. Those who failed were labeled lazy, insubordinate, criminal. Punishment then became law. And law, when written by the conqueror, is merciless. Ask yourself, how do you sell brutality to a civilized nation? You don't show the rope or the whip. You show numbers instead. You show profits. You show charts that the boardrooms understand. You show progress reports that replace the names of people with statistics. The language of empire perfected this deception. Words like native, savage, primitive turned humans into categories on a ledger. It became easy to claim that those people needed governance, guidance, discipline. It became easy to claim that the unnatural suffering was for a higher good. And so, villages emptied not because of conquest at bayonet point, but because someone in a distant office had decided crops were more valuable shipped abroad than eaten at home. Railways were built, not for the benefit of local markets, but to move raw materials faster to European ports. Schools taught in foreign tongues, training clerks rather than leaders. A new elite rose, men who spoke the colonizer's language and enforced the colonizer's laws. They were the visible face of the illusion, collaborators in a system they barely controlled. But every illusion requires plausible enemies. So empire built narratives of chaos and anarchy to justify its rule. It told stories of internecine warfare, of backward customs, of people unable to govern themselves. And when resistance came, because resistance always comes, the empire called it rebellion. Rebellion justified repression. Repression justified more rule. Consider a trading post on the West African coast. A small stone house with a flag, ledger books, and a cannon. A local chief signs a treaty he cannot read. He believes he is granting a trading agreement. The empire records it as a protectorate. Years later, when taxes are demanded and sons conscripted, the same paper becomes proof that sovereignty had been surrendered. The trick was bureaucratic, not military. Paper had power. What of the missionaries? Some truly believed they were saving souls. Some men did want schools, hospitals, knowledge. But belief does not excuse blindness. When a mission builds a school on the edge of a forced labor camp, it becomes complicit. The moral language around saving allowed many to ignore the suffering that fed their institutions. The jungle stayed silent, but the silence itself was a scream. Insects hummed over the ruins of villages, and the river carried whispers that no one in Europe would ever hear. This is the ugly genius of the civilizing myth. It turns crimes into development plans. It turns theft into treaties. It turns occupation into care. And then there were the men who profited most visibly, merchants, concessionaires, and private companies, who used laws to cloak plunder. They secured monopolies, they enforced quotas, they hired native intermediaries and set the terms of trade. The system appeared orderly, its victims were invisible. So why did Europe accept it so willingly? Because it fit a story they wanted to believe. That Western rule brought order to chaos, light to darkness. Admit otherwise, and one must confront a different truth, that civilization, as practiced then, was often indistinguishable from calculated theft. For those on the receiving end, the results were immediate and brutal. Economies collapsed, social structures fractured. Entire ways of life were forced to adapt to new demands. Young men were conscripted into foreign wars, women lost land, elders lost authority. Languages lost words that once mattered. The long-term damage was not only physical, it was cultural, psychological, structural. Borders drawn in Berlin insisted that tribes once allied or related now belonged to separate colonies. Kinship was split by lines on a map. New states would later inherit those lines and fight over them, as if the ink itself had sown the seeds of future conflict. The illusion of civilization also sold a final lie, that the conqueror would eventually withdraw, leaving behind a modern nation grateful for tutelage. History rarely follows such convenient scripts. Instead, the conqueror entrenched systems that continued long after the flags changed. Infrastructure favored extraction. Legal systems favored foreign capital. Education trained administrators, not founders. And for every map that promised order, a new war brewed in the margins. Small uprisings flared. Rebellions were crushed. A generation grew with the knowledge that their land had been taken by a meeting they did not attend. So the civilizing mission, a noble phrase in speeches, became the instrument of control. It convinced many in Europe that they were doing good, while ensuring they would profit from the tragedy they authored. What remains is a continent reconfigured by strangers, a people taught to adapt to the needs of others, and a history that hides the violence beneath euphemism. If the Berlin Conference had a morale, it was this: civilization as exported can be a mask. Beneath it, ambition and profit keep beating like a heart, untroubled by conscience. Now we discuss about how the ink of Berlin turned into a rush of flags and guns across Africa, how treaties on paper became chains in the ground, how the lines they drew would, within years, ignite into violence the conference claimed to prevent. When the diplomats left Berlin, they congratulated each other for bringing order to Africa. But the ink on their maps was still wet. And already it was bleeding. The scramble for Africa had begun. Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Portugal, each raced to plant their flag wherever they could, even if it meant erasing entire civilizations to do it. And here's the irony. Most of them had no idea what they were claiming. They drew borders across deserts they'd never crossed, rivers they couldn't name, mountains no European had ever seen. Yet those borders still exist today. Villages found themselves split in half. Families woke up to discover they now lived in two countries. Tribes that had coexisted for centuries were suddenly enemies, because a line on a European map said so. But perhaps the darkest shadow fell over the Congo. King Leopold II of Belgium didn't just take land, he took lives. Under the pretense of civilization, his men forced millions into labor to extract ivory and rubber. Hands were cut off as punishment for not meeting quotas. Whole communities vanished into the jungle and were never seen again. They called it progress, but it was built on bones. And while the world looked away, Africa bled silently. Its people turned into resources, its kingdoms erased from memory. Yet even then, something stirred. In the ashes of conquest, whispers of resistance began to rise. Voices that refused to be forgotten. Men and women who looked at those borders and said, "No more." But by then it was too late to undo what had been set in motion, because those lines, those invisible scars, would define the next 100 years of African history and shape every war, every revolution, every cry for freedom that followed. The Berlin Conference may have ended in 1885, but its war never really stopped. It simply changed its weapons. The map of Africa was complete, but so was the map of future wars. What began in Berlin would echo through the 20th century. From trenches to revolutions, each line of ink bleeding into blood.